لا إله إلا الله محمد رسول الله.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا ومولانا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. أهلا وسهلا ومرحبا بكم. I welcome you back to our course on Ibn Hajar's Nukhba al-Fikr towards understanding the core concepts in Hadith theory. Bi-idhnillahi ta'ala, we are now in the 6th lesson of this course, and we are still looking at the development of the science to the point of actually having Hadith theory, or a set of jargon, a set of technical terms. And our course outcomes towards understanding Hadith and its role in Islam, mastering standard Hadith terminology, as well as understanding Hadith preservation, transmission, and authentication, bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. So in this lesson, we will look at the 3 steps of Hadith criticism by way of revision through a different lens, bi-idhnillah. Then rating transmitters and contiguity, an important element in Hadith criticism, as well as the Hadith classification based on the number of chains. In other words, point number 3 over here is an indication that we are officially starting with the text of Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. Of course, we have introduced the text of Ibn Hajar before, and we dealt with the first opening paragraph, the Hamd and the Salawat. The second paragraph read, فإن التصانيف في اصطلاح أهل الحديث قد كثرت وبسطت واختصرت فسألني بعض الإخوان أن ألخص له المهم من ذلك فأجبته إلى سؤاله رجاء الاندراج في تلك المسالك. He said that there are many compilations, there are many books that have been authored in relation to the technical terms of the people of Hadith, the scholars of Hadith. They've become a lot and they have become extensive, and then there's also summaries. But he was asked by certain students and certain scholars to specifically summarize in a very comprehensive way the most important matters therein. He says, I then responded to their question, to their request, with the hope that I'll be included in this path. So we asked the question, is Ibn Hajar speaking prospectively or retrospectively about the sciences of Hadith? And of course he's speaking retrospectively, he's looking back on the development. So then we asked the question, now how did Hadith develop to this stage? Now that was our impetus to commence with a number of discussions. We've looked at what is a Hadith, we've given a brief introduction to that. We've looked at the Hadith origin story, mainly asking when, why, and how were a Hadith transmitted, documented, and preserved. Then we looked at writing as a means of preservation of Hadith, as well as the stages of writing, from informal writing all the way till formal writing and composition. We then looked through the various genres of Hadith literature, including the Musannaf literature. We've given a brief introduction to that. The Musnad literature, which were Hadith-centric compilations. Then the Sahih and Sunan movement, which specifically focused on the authentic and prophetic-centric ahadith. Then we moved on to discuss various methods and the history of Hadith criticism, how to verify important news or information. In a previous lesson, we looked at emergence of fabrication and methods of counteracting it. That was our last lesson. Walillahi alhamd. Now we will look at Hadith criticism within a contemporary lens via a text by Dr. Jonathan Brown, Muhammad's Legacy in the Medieval and Modern World. Now, Dr. Jonathan Brown is a contemporary Hadith scholar, Muslim scholar, predominantly in the academic world, and he wrote this text. He's one of my teachers, and I actually studied this text with him in a Hadith class within the academic space. And I like his approach because he's taking the traditional framework and he's presenting it within a contemporary setting and answering many contemporary issues, or rather problems that you may find within contemporary circles, by providing solutions from the tradition of Islam. So looking at his approach, and specifically within Hadith criticism, he makes a number of interesting points that I think we should just basically go through and then enter into Ibn Hajar's work, bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. So his description of the method of hadith criticism, he says early scholars like Imam al-Bukhari and Imam Muslim, they used common sense methods to determine report reliability. When they looked at a hadith, it was a working science. It wasn't, here's a book with certain terminologies. This is the meaning of sahih. This is the meaning of this. This is the meaning of that. And just have a distilled definition of everything. Instead, they looked at it as a very practical approach, a very practical exercise of trying to verify whether the Prophet ﷺ said something or not. So in relation to this, the verification process is similar to modern investigative journalism. The example that he gave us, and we've used this example before, was that of a modern reporter verifying a source about an earthquake by contacting multiple sources from where the reported earthquake took place. So, for example, the reporter would say to his editor, I've heard a report that there was a tremendous, a huge earthquake off the scales on the measurement charts, the Richter scale, that came out of China. So the editor will then ask, okay, what's your source? Where did you get this information from? So the reporter will then say, okay, I got this information from, mathalan, a friend in China. So the editor will then ask, is your story corroborated? Is your source corroborated? So what this means is, either you have evidence from a different source that this actually transpired, or the source that reported to you, you've already verified that this is a reliable source. How? Because you've checked on numerous occasions that whatever this person has transmitted to you, it was corroborated by others. To the point where, let's say there was an incident at the beginning of the year and your source was accurate. Why? How do you know that? Because you checked with a plethora of other sources that this is in fact an accurate representation of what transpired. Then later on in the year, something else happens. Then the same source gives you more information and you verify again, you check, you corroborate. Did this in fact happen according to the way my source reported it? And this continues until eventually you reach a point with that particular source, having a good understanding of how reliable that source is, how accurate that source is, where afterwards you won't necessarily go and corroborate every single time this person transmits something to you. Why? Because you've already corroborated the source. So the source in fact is now considered reliable, at least to you, because you've done your investigation. So this was the example that we were using, and this is the example that's put forward in this kitab. So we continue. The questions essentially is, who is your source and is your source corroborated? Then Dr. Brown gives us, as opposed to the previous analysis wherein Shaykh Nuruddin Itar, rahimahullah ta'ala, Dr. Nuruddin Itar, he mentions there were 4 essential stages that the scholars approached, or that they formulated in order to combat hadith forgery. Now we discussed the emergence of forgery, why it took place, how it took place. But what was more important than the reality of forgery was the methods that were employed to combat forgery. So the traditional breakdown by Dr. Nuruddin Itar, as we saw previously, was number 1, they demanded an isnad. Number 2, they took up the what would we call this? They took up the means of a rihla, right? Taking specific journeys to go and find the best possible source for a particular report, traveling great distances and making a career out of it. Then number 3, they would resort to corroboration, and then they would also verify the reliability of a particular narrator, transmitter, one by one in a particular chain, looking for his reliability. So Dr. Brown has distilled this for us into 3 steps as opposed to 4. Still, the addition of the rihla stage is probably going to be part of this 3-tiered approach, which we actually calls it a 3-tiered approach. And what is the 3-tiered method? The 3-tiered method is number 1, the isnad. Number 2, rating transmitters, meaning you actually verify and you rate each and every transmitter in the chain, and then establishing contiguity. So you make sure that your chain is not a broken chain. There are no missing links in the chain. Each and every narrator has a link to the person that he's narrating from. And then finally, finding corroboration, and that is essentially what we've just discussed in terms of that reporter, but there are other ways for corroboration as well. Now, inshallah, what we would like to do is to look at each one of these points in the three-tiered approach and actually try to analyze what each point consists of. Now, the first one, we've given a lot of attention to the isnad and the importance of the isnad. We've demonstrated what the isnad looks like. We've shown you a few examples of an isnad and the various features of an isnad. So from the ground up, we look at the definition of the isnad. Isnad, from the word sanada, means to support, and it is the essential building block of the hadith critical method. Without the isnad, there is no science of hadith criticism, essentially. There's very few things that we can do in terms of verification of a report without the chain of transmission. Then he says that this concept, the isnad concept, it became the veritable symbol of the cult of authenticity in Sunni Islam. It's an interesting expression, the cult of authenticity, because the isnad was the impetus for every single other science, tafsir, qira'at, every other science that we can think of. The isnad was the system that established connection with the Prophet ﷺ, but also a point of verification. So today, if you open up a book like the tafsir of Muhammad ibn Jarir al-Tabari, rahimahullah ta'ala, and you find a plethora of reports, not all of them are going to meet the same standards of authenticity as, say, for example, a hadith in the Sahih of Imam al-Bukhari. Now, why that is, it's a matter of the author's choice and his objectives. But what that gives us now is a means towards verifying the authenticity of every single report, regardless of its source. So whether you find it in the tafsir of Imam al-Tabari or in the a book by Imam al-Bayhaqi or Hakim al-Naysaburi, wherever the hadith may find itself, as long as it has an isnad, this was the first reference point that we could utilize in order to verify, did the Prophet ﷺ say something or not. So the scholars demanded asanid. Where did this practice come from? It was the first line of defense against hadith fabrication. How so? The isnad ensures the authenticity of hadith by tracing it back to the Prophet ﷺ. If somebody could not provide an isnad, tracing it back to the Prophet ﷺ, then we wouldn't even regard it, we wouldn't even listen to the statement because the person was unable to provide an isnad. Now, needless to say, just because you can mention, a chain going back to the Prophet ﷺ doesn't necessarily mean that chain is problem free. You have to still analyze the chain. But the chain itself became as he says, the veritable axis, the veritable axis upon which authenticity revolves. So if you look at the quote by Abdullah ibn Mubarak, rahimahullah ta'ala, one of our great luminaries in traditional Islam, he said, the isnad is part of deen. Al-isnadu min ad-deen. Right? Lawla al-isnad, if it were not for the isnad, then laqala man sha'a ma sha'a. Then whoever wanted could say whatever they wanted. If you didn't have this facility of an isnad, then somebody could just say, the Prophet ﷺ said this, the Sahabi said this, the Tabi'i said that. But because of an isnad, you were compelled to produce your source, right? This was the first line of defense. So this is an important statement. It's worthwhile memorizing the statement by Abdullah ibn Mubarak, rahimahullah ta'ala, which again reads, al-isnadu min ad-din, lawla al-isnad laqala man sha'a ma sha'a. The statement continues and he says, but if you were to ask them, who told you this? They cannot reply. Right, they'd be silent. So that's the first line of defense. If you look at Imam Shafi'i's declaration about the isnad, which is also a beautiful statement to memorize and it provides much insight, there's a lot of wisdom in it. He says, the person who seeks knowledge without an isnad, not asking where is this from, is like a person gathering wood at night. He carries on his back a bundle of wood when there may be a viper in that could bite him. So this is like gathering firewood in the dark, You don't know what you're picking up, right? You don't know what you're picking up. So that was a statement by Imam Shafi'i rahimahullah ta'ala. Let's look at another tabi'i, and that was Muhammad ibn Sirin. Muhammad ibn Sirin, he said that in the early period, right, we did not ask one another about the isnad. We wouldn't ask each other about, where did you get this from? But when the fitna occurred, and again, the fitna is a term that refers to, in general, it refers to trouble, right? Problems that arise. But when he uses it here, our historians are of the opinion that this is in all probability a reference to the second civil war among the companions, Ridwanullahi ta'ala alayhim ajma'in, which took place around 680 to 692 Common Era. They began to say, Sammu lana rijalakum, name for us your sources, right? Tell us who your men are, tell us who your reporters are. This then allowed the Ummah to differentiate between Ahlul Sunnah, right, the people who followed the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba, so the majority of Muslims, compared to the people of heresy, Ahlul Bid'ah. What gave rise to this? Political strife, but the political strife eventually turns into theological debates and theological differences. And it is from that period onwards that we find this huge rift between the Ahlul Sunnah and the Shi'i schools of thought. And this was also a distinction between the tradition of Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah and the Hadith utilized by Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah and others. So the isnad once again finds its center stage in this distinction. Wallahu subhanahu wa ta'ala a'lam. If you look at Shu'bah ibn al-Hajjaj al-Qushayri, who is one of the early Hadith critics, he said, all religious knowledge, all ilm, which does not feature haddathana or akhbarana, meaning he narrated to me or he reported to me, which is the components of the isnad. Any type of religious knowledge that does not feature that is nothing but vinegar and sprouts, meaning there's no substance to it. Now within traditional Islam, the isnad continues to hold this very important and central position. Today, when a student studies in the traditional circles, right, in a traditional seminary, the understanding is that the student is taking from teachers who took from teachers, who took from teachers, who took from teachers, tracing the line of knowledge all the way back to the Prophet ﷺ in a sanad. And even though it is no longer, after the period of compilation of all of the ahadith that we really have, the isnad was no longer critically important for authenticity purposes, because as far as establishing whether the Prophet ﷺ said something or not, we would still utilize the isnad and rely on the isnad, but from the books of ahadith, which composes those ahadith, and we would verify that all the way to the Prophet ﷺ. But after that period, the isnad continues. So you have a sanad, I have a sanad, for example, from my teachers that leads me up to, say, the Jami' of Imam Tirmidhi, right? But I don't go through that sanad to see whether every hadith in the Sunan of Imam Tirmidhi is authentic. No, I go straight to Imam Tirmidhi, and from Imam Tirmidhi to the Prophet ﷺ, and I would check the isnad there. And if that is authentic, then we regard it as authentic, because after it is composed in that manner, it spreads so widely that you cannot really distort it without being detected thereafter. Yet the isnad remains important because it provides myself and yourself and the traditional circle of Islamic students. It gives us a connection to the Prophet ﷺ, and still within traditional circles you have this idea of taking your knowledge from this line of transmission that goes back to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Knowledge without this is not considered traditional knowledge, strictly speaking, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. So once again, the three concepts were isnad, rating transmitters and establishing contiguity, right, and finding corroboration. What have we just discussed now? right now we have just discussed the isnad, so we can take that off our list. That means we move on to the next section, which deals with rating transmitters and establishing contiguity. How exactly does this take place? Transmitter evaluation criteria is the question. How do you evaluate a transmitter? If a reporter comes to you today, what are you going to look at in order to check whether you can trust this link in your chain or not? Now, we've been through the example of the earthquake and the corroboration. But right now, if you just take one single individual and you want to make an assessment on that individual, because this individual is a link towards some source of information, there are essentially two matters that our scholars have identified and have been the building blocks of a reliable narrator. Now, in Arabic, a reliable narrator is called a fiqh, right? A fiqh is essentially somebody that is trustworthy. You can check him off. He meets the standards for transmission and authentication. So the word fiqh was initially employed by Imam Malik, rahimahullah ta'ala, which we'll see shortly. But what does it consist of? What exactly is a reliable narrator? It's not just a theoretical, or rather it's not just an idea, but it's something that can be precisely identified. So the two qualities that make up for a fiqh, that make up what a fiqh is, right, are adala, integrity and character, as well as dabt, precision or accuracy. Integrity and character means that we evaluate the transmitter's piety, his correct belief, and his uprightness. This would ensure that the transmitter is morally and ethically reliable. Now, immediately the first question comes to mind. How do you assess someone's piety? How do you assess someone's belief? How do you assess someone's uprightness? The rule that is employed by the scholars is نحكم بالظواهر والله يتولى السرائر. We judge based on what is apparent. So if somebody is a Muslim, they perform their salah, they don't express any heretical beliefs, they generally live their lives as good people, then this is enough to establish that the person is righteous. And this is only a declaration on their apparent behavior. We don't know the reality of one another. Wallahu yatawalla sarair. Allah knows the reality of that person. But bear in mind that when you partake in the system of isnad, that the scholars were extremely critical. There are some instances in which a scholar, or rather a hadith transmitter, would be discarded and abandoned because he mistreated an animal, or because he was seen urinating in the road, or because he tempted an animal with some food, some bait, and then when the animal came closer, he took the food away. These are some of the reports that demonstrate that at times, not always, but at times, they were very meticulous about whose transmissions they would accept. Now, when somebody was known to be a scholar, when somebody was known to be a student of Islam and a student of Hadith, then of course the face value of that person's integrity is sound. So this was the first means. Personal identification of that person, their contemporaries' testification about who they were and what type of people they were. This would be sufficient to establish that the person is somebody of adala. In other words, as long as a particular narrator did not have any obvious discrepancies that would cause us to raise the red flag about him or her, then we would consider them at face value to be reliable, to be a person of integrity, in other words, adala. But that was not as important as the second component of being a thiqah, right? And the second component of being a thiqah is dabt, or accuracy, right? How accurate is this person in relation to what they report? How would they establish this, right? You cannot just at face value say, well, this person is accurate, this person is inaccurate. So again, like we spoke about in the example of the person narrating that there's an earthquake in China, we would look at other reports coming from China and whether they verify what this person is saying. So that's one incident. Then the person reports something else, and again we would check how accurate is their information in comparison to that of others who we know is reliable. And so corroboration takes place over an extensive period, over a body of transmitted material that we can compare with their contemporaries and eventually arrive at an evaluation, remark ourselves. And we can say that, look, based on our assessment of this narrator, in corroborating him or her with other reporters from the same sources, we find them to either be accurate or not as accurate. So there's different levels of dabt or accuracy. This would scrutinize the transmitter's reports or the corpus of the reports and their narration practices, right? This would also determine if the transmitter's reports are consistent and accurate. So these two matters, adala and dabt, if they can be checked off, right? If you can make a check mark with dabt and you can make a check mark with adala, then collectively these two factors would entail that the transmitter is a thiqah. And once you know that the transmitter in question is a thiqah, you move on to the next transmitter, and so you evaluate every transmitter in a particular sanad to the point where you can say all the transmitters in this chain are reliable. Okay, so that's the essence of hadith criticism, how it is managed in a very practical way. Now, in this book, there's also some discussion on historical development. Again, I'm speaking about hadith, Muhammad's legacy in the medieval and modern world. So I'll just briefly show you the type of information to understand some of the hadith critics, who they were, and the names that you should be familiar with, at least eventually, inshallah. In the first generation, which in the common era that would be the 8th century, you have the likes of Shu'ba ibn al-Hajjaj. That's the second time his name had come up in this presentation. Imam Malik ibn Anas of the Maliki school, Sufyan al-Thawri, Layth ibn Sa'ad, the Mufti of Egypt, also contemporary of Imam Malik and Imam Shafi'i rahimahumullah ta'ala, Sufyan ibn Uyayna. These were the early critics. They initiated collectively, and specifically Sufyan ibn Uyayna, the collection and examination of hadith and narrators. Imam Malik introduced technical terms like thiqah, reliable. Okay, so we can understand now that what we just learned about what makes a hadith narrator reliable, that term thiqah was originated, or first used rather, by Imam Malik rahimahullahu ta'ala. And then he also takes us through the prominent hadith critics and their contributions. Some of the notable critics and their influence, including the students of the first generation, would be Abdul Rahman ibn Mahdi, right? He is the scholar, great scholar of Islam, who actually asked Imam Shafi'i rahimahullah ta'ala to compose the Risala to give expression to the Ahlul Hadith for how exactly they arrive at their rulings, and that's why we have the Risala now. Then there's Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Qattan, and they also influenced later critics like Ibn Hanbal, Yahya ibn Ma'in, and Ali ibn al-Madini, all of whom are some of the great luminaries of the Islamic tradition. Further down the line, you have the refinement of hadith criticism, where you find our two shaykhs, Imam al-Bukhari and Imam Muslim, the critics of Ray, Abu Zur'a al-Razi and Abu Hatim al-Razi, the influential figures, An-Nasa'i, Ibn Abi Hatim al-Razi, Ibn Adi, Ibn Hibban al-Busti, Abu al-Hasan al-Daraqutni, and Imam al-Hakim al-Naysaburi, the teacher of Imam al-Bayhaqi. These were some of the later critics who refined the art of hadith criticism, and many of whom composed works specifically around hadith and hadith criticism. Now, we spoke about the practical process, right? So you take your sanad and you go through each narrator, verifying whether this person is one of integrity, adala, and precision, dabt. And if they are, that means this narrator is a thiqah. You move on to the next narrator, and so forth. Why did they do this? To ensure the transmitters were well known and sufficiently identified. it also gave us a way to analyze, right, make analysis of the reports, also known as i'tibar, which was the collection and comparison of reports from various teachers, checking for corroboration among different students of the same teacher. This is the concept behind establishing authenticity. From this, our scholars also developed a list of, what would we call this? Classification terminology. So when you classify a particular transmitter, yes, you can say is a thiqah, is reliable. But there are, of course, going to be different levels of reliability. So some transmitters will be so reliable that they're almost unquestionably reliable, while others are going to be acceptable. And then you're going to get some narrators who are unreliable. But even the levels of unreliability are going to be different. So you see there are various grades of reliability. And for this reason, the scholars adopted a system of terminology that described the reliability of transmitters. And an example of this would be the terminology employed by Ibn Abi Hatim al-Razi, where he gives us at least 8 categories. So herein, for example, he says number 1 is reliable, or just thiqah, also known as mutqin, right? And other terms as well. Some actually have a level of reliability that's even higher than this, and they would say thiqatun thiqah, right? Reliable. Just to give you an understanding of the various grades. In this type of category, it would be unhesitatingly used in legal scholarship. The next line would be sincere, or saduq, or la ba'sa bihi. Okay, so this is also reliable, but used if corroborated. Okay, another level below that, vulnerable. Such a person would be termed shaykh, according to Ibn Abi Hatim al-Razi, slightly weaker but still recorded. The next category would be salih. Again, these are only the terms according to Ibn Abi Hatim al-Razi. Why I'm saying that is various other critics developed their own peculiar system of categorization or classification, and there are some differences among the scholars. Now that discussion is a science on its own. Okay, so that is dealt with in a science known as jarh wa ta'dil, the vindication and vilification of transmitters. And it deals with how exactly the scholars utilized various terminology to describe the reliability of a narrator, and also how they arrive at that particular classification. Tamam. Then further down the line, he's got layyinul hadith, right? So we said salih, then layyinul hadith, used cautiously. Laysa biqawi, used for identifying corroboration only. Da'if, it depends on the context, right? Whether you can use him or not. And then somebody who is a liar or abandoned. Matrukul hadith, dhahibul hadith, or kadhab, not used at all. Some have even harsher terms than this, but these are some of the basic terminologies employed to classify narrators. Now this may seem harsh if it's the first time that you're coming across hadith criticism. So the science of jarh and ta'dil literally is about declaring somebody reliable or unreliable. Now in our daily life, this would be impermissible. You don't go around classifying people and speaking about their weaknesses and the like. But this is not daily life. This is about the preservation of the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So the discussion about permissible ghiba and the need for the science, that is part of what you address within the science of jarh wa ta'dil. It's a subspecies basically, or a subcategory of ulumul hadith. Right? There are various categories within ulumul hadith. Just like in ulumul Quran, you would have tafsir as a sub-science, right? So in ulumul hadith, you have jarh and ta'dil as a sub-science, and there are various others as well. Tamam. So the next issue at hand is the contiguity of transmission. Now remember, we said we will analyze every link in the chain to check whether the person has adala and dabt. That means that they are thiqah. These are terms that you need to be familiar with, right? So every link in the chain must be categorized as reliable or thiqah in order for us to deem the hadith as authentic. But is that the only criteria? So you have a list of names of people who are categorized as reliable. Does that mean that the hadith is necessarily authentic? At face value, it may seem yes, that is the case. But another important element, critical element, is that the chain must be unbroken. So in other words, you must establish contiguity, right? It must be an unbroken chain. In Arabic, this is known as ittisal. Ittisalu sanad means the contiguity of the chain of transmission. So what's the importance of contiguity in hadith transmission? It is essential to verify that each transmitter in the isnad, the chain of transmission, directly heard the hadith from their teacher. Without continuity, the chain is considered broken or munqati', which is another technical term, and it would thus be unreliable. So if, for example, in the sanad, you have a thiqah narrating from a thiqah, narrating from a thiqah, narrating from a thiqah. But upon closer inspection, you notice that, hold on a minute, this thiqah and the one that he's narrating from lived so far apart that it would have been impossible for them to have met, and it would have been impossible for them to have transmitted from each other directly. So there's a missing link in the chain. How do you determine this? Because this narrator lived 150 years after the other narrator, as an example. That data point in and of itself is sufficient to establish that there's a broken link in this chain. So even though all the transmitters are thiqah, they are reliable, that chain has a missing link, and therefore the chain is unreliable, and the hadith would be regarded as unreliable accordingly. So ittisal or ittisalu sanad, contiguity of the chain of transmission, is an essential component in hadith criticism. How would they do this again? I mentioned one way. Let's look at some of the others. Firstly, they would look for direct phrases. If the transmitter who is thiqah, right, already known to be reliable, if he says haddathani, transmitted to me, then you would take that statement as a veritable truth, that somebody actually narrated to him, because that is what he's saying. And how do we trust what he's saying? Because we've already checked that he's a person of integrity and that he's a person of precision, right? So that is out of the way already. Now we are looking at the way that he transmits. And the way that he transmits would give us a clue as to whether he transmitted directly or not. So he says haddathani, or he says akhbarana, I heard from, sami'tu min. These are examples of direct transmission phrases. There are also indirect phrases where he says according to, or an. He could also say qala, he said, right? Or anna, right? These could indicate direct or indirect transmission. Because if I say that a particular scholar, let's say I mention that Mufti Taha said, so that is not me indicating that, look, there's direct transmission. I didn't say I heard from Mufti Taha. Another example, I could say Dr. Jonathan Brown said. That could mean that I read it in his book. That could mean that I watched a video or I listened to an interview and there he said something. But it doesn't mean that I heard it directly from him. But in the world of hadith transmission, if I say sami'tu min, right, sami'tuhu minhu, I heard this from him, or I say akhbarana or haddathani, then these terms mean that I am saying I heard it directly from him. So of course, to use direct transmission phrases is going to be much more considered and weighty than to use indirect transmission phrases like an, from, or qala, he said. Okay, so these are some of the means by which the scholars employed understanding contiguity. Of course, that's not the only one. Let's look at some of the others. A very important one, and this is the one that I used as an example, is to look at the dates of their deaths and the locations where they lived and where they moved about to confirm possible direct transmission. Now, how do we know all these things? How do we know the dates of their birth, the dates of their death? How do we know their locations and where they moved and who their teachers were, who their students were, to confirm possible direct transmission? The answer is there are voluminous works. Right? Some of the most encyclopedic works in traditional Islam are works of al-Rijal, right? Kutub al-Rijal, which is essentially biographical works. Now, if you were to see, and I don't know how exactly I would do this, but if you were to see the extensive works available even now, right, about the narrators of Hadith, it would amaze you to see the extent of research that our tradition has actually achieved. Every transmitter of Hadith within the 6 books, right, has practically an entire biography that you can write about him or her from certain books. And beyond that, any other transmitter of Hadith, you're going to find some information about them. If you don't, right, then that's a problem, and we can speak about that later on. But if you open up any sanad and you look at who is in that sanad and you want to know something about that individual, you will be able to find with not a lot of effort, right, the date of their birth, the date of their death, where they were from, where they lived, who their teachers were, who their students were, and you'll be able to find something about their integrity and something about their accuracy, because this is the framework within which hadith criticism takes place. So biography literature or kutubur rijal is a critical part of establishing contiguity of transmission, but also, of course, to check, if you want to know if a particular narrator has adala or dabt, that would be found in the books of rijal. Okay, so it's a profound science and there's lots of different components, but what we are doing now is trying to create an overview so you understand the context of hadith terminology, where it fits in and why it's important to know, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So now we've checked off from our list 2 of the 3 components. In actual fact, we've checked off 3, but for our purposes here, we looked at the isnad, we looked at rating transmitters as well as establishing contiguity, and then of course we started off, right, because we did this in the previous lesson, we started off discussing finding corroboration. But also in relation to finding corroboration, there were other ways that they looked for corroboration. Even after you've established the reliability of a narrator, there's still the report in question. So you have a thiqah from a thiqah from a thiqah, you have contiguity in the chain, so you say this hadith is authentic. But what if it isn't? What if the hadith isn't as authentic as it can be? Perhaps there was a problem with 1 or 2 of the narrators in terms of the precision, so the precision was not fully there. So now you're sitting with a hadith that's less than absolutely reliable. Now, I'm not using the formal terms because we still have to learn them. But can this hadith be strengthened? Are there other narrations that say a similar thing to this hadith? Now we're not looking at corroborating the transmitter. Now we are looking at corroboration of the report itself. So you have one less than reliable chain transmitting something from the Prophet ﷺ, but the chain itself doesn't lend itself towards us saying authentic. But then you have another one, a different chain, saying a similar thing that's also not at the level of full reliability. And then you maybe have another one and another one. So these chains, they are different from one another. Okay, so it's not the same transmitter in every chain. You have different transmitters, and yet all of these chains report the same information. Individually, this particular chain doesn't reach the status of authenticity. But if you have a fairly reliable one here, a weak one here, a weak one there, another semi-reliable one there, you put them all together and they form a new picture. And this is also part of hadith criticism, finding corroboration. Remember, a hadith, a single hadith, meaning a single chain with a single matan, that is one data point. You don't find one hadith saying a thing and then you regard this as the be-all and end-all of that report. This is why in the hadith genres, the various compilations that we went through, if you, for example, look at the Sahih of Imam Muslim, right, you would find that one after the other, there would be contradictory ahadith. Right? You would find one hadith saying the Prophet ﷺ sat and drank, and the next one would say he stood and drank. Why would he do this? Because one hadith is a data point, the other hadith is another data point. The muhaddith looks at all of these data points to end up with a picture of what exactly transpired. So he would say, that this report, this incident, right, has been authentically transmitted or not. Okay, and then which level of reliability is this incident at? That is now a more complete data point. The faqih takes that information and derives fiqh therefrom. The faqih does not go to the individual data points and only extrapolates information from that data point. The jurist would look at the entire picture, which he requires the muhaddith for, and he's a muhaddith himself. So it is the final outcome of the hadith that would then translate into Islamic law. To give us an example, so corroboration even becomes part of the process at the end when trying to establish what exactly is the authenticity or the reliability of a particular narrator. So as an example, he gives us Ibn Hibban's method, wherein he verifies initial transmission to check if the report is transmitted by multiple students of the same teacher or not. And then he checks other levels to see if reliable transmitters corroborate the report from the same source. Ensure the report is consistent across different levels of the isnad. Now, I don't want to get into the weeds of hadith corroboration, because it would become part of our text. It would become part of the study of Ibn Hajar and the Nukhba al-Fikr. With all of that out of the way, walillah alhamd, I believe that now we have covered enough introductory discussions to contextualize the study of the Nukhba. What you have now seen is a bird's eye view of not only the historical development, but also the complexity of the hadith sciences. Now, all of this gives us a list of terms, of jargon, of technical terminology that was utilized, firstly formulated and then utilized by the scholars to describe hadith and to give expression to the science. From the process of recording a hadith all the way through to narrator criticism, jarh and ta'dil, all the way through to corroboration, all of these acts and efforts resulted in the formulation of terms. We saw Imam Malik using the term thiqah, and now we can use the term thiqah and we can explain what it is. And like that, there's also other terms: sahih, hasan, da'if, right, mawdu'. These are terms that they give us expression to the hadith science. And generally, learning this terminology in traditional circles is one of the first entry points into the science of hadith. What we have done is we have first given a bird's eye view over the entire process, and now we're going to enter into the terminology. So the Nukhba of Imam Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani rahimahullah ta'ala comes much later on, in the 10th century, 10th, 11th century. You find now the Nukhba al-Fikr gives us a distilled version of the terminology that we need to know and learn and memorize to be able to understand the hadith science better, to be able to practically engage with the science of hadith. And that's the key. Knowing mustalahul hadith, which is essentially what the Nukhba is about. Fi mustalahi ahli al-athar. It is istilahat, technical terms. Knowing those technical terms and the definitions does not mean that a student knows how to be a muhaddith, right? Or that the student is able to classify hadith and to determine its authenticity. Knowing hadith terminology is not enough. But in order to engage with the science at every level that we've discussed and other levels as well, it is an essential element to be familiar with those technical terms. So what we're going to do is, we're not only going to learn the technical terms by way of saying this is the term and this is the definition. We also want you to understand where exactly this term fits in. So you can, as you grow and as you learn more, you can understand the relevance of these terms. If you don't study it in this way, what I find is that it becomes very theoretical, impractical, and somewhat obscure or abstract. It's just about learning a bunch of definitions and that's it. But instead, if you look at the definition as a working principle and try to understand how it applies in reality to a hadith, seeing it in practice, seeing an example of that in every case, it allows you to have a data point, rather not a data point, but a database of terminology that you can decipher, right, the science of hadith with. This sort of practical approach I find to be far easier than to simply enter into memorizing hadith terms. So let us just introduce what is going to come in the next lesson, inshallah, because now we have officially entered into the technical terms of the Nukhba by Imam Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. So to commence, he says, and not only do the opening of this, right? He says, فَأَقُول, so I say, al-khabaru, khabar. Now if we translate khabar here, it wouldn't make sense. It just means news or information. But khabar here is referring to a hadith, right? Any hadith, any report. So khabar is at the top. إِمَّا أَن يَكُونَ لَهُ تُرُكٌ بِلَا عَدَدٍ مُعَيَّنٍ. Either you're going to have a khabar that has turuq, pathways, bila adadin muayyanin, without any specific number. Meaning there are so many pathways to that particular piece of information that you cannot really specify how many chains there are. So they, at every level, at the level of the Sahaba, at the level of the Tabi'een, at the level of the Atba'u Tabi'een, there are so many links to a particular report. What type of khabar is that? He says, that's one type, and we put that on the side here. أو مع حصر, or you're going to have a khabar that has a limit. What type of limit? بما فوق الاثنين, either a limit of having more than two narrators in every level of transmission. So at the level of the Sahaba, there's more than two, three or more. At the level of the Tabi'een, there's more than two, three or more, and so on and so forth, right? Or, he says, أو بهما, or you'll have a report that only has a minimum of two transmitters at every level. A minimum of two transmitters. So it can have 3, 4, 5 at different levels, but it never gets below 2. أو بواحد, or you have a report that goes down to one transmitter at some level, usually at the level of the Sahaba, because one Sahabi would have seen a particular incident and then transmitted to several Tabi'een, and then it just grows from there. So this is a classification of hadith based on the number of links that we have to a particular report in every level of transmission. Based on this, we have a classification to commence with. So Ibn Hajar is teaching us here that you have turuq bila adad, you have many ways, many links, and you have limited links. So carrying on from that, he says, فَالْأَوَّلُ, the first type, meaning without limits, without a specific number of links, but just a lot at every level, that is called mutawatir. And the others, all of them collectively are called ahad. So mutawatir and ahad. Now, this is just an introduction. We'll go through this meticulously again in the next lesson, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So you don't have to worry about all of this. We'll go through that. But the first category is important. Based on how many links we have to a report, the report is either going to be mutawatir or it's going to be ahad. If it is unlimited, meaning you have more than 3 at least, you have 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 links at every point in transmission, then that hadith is regarded as mutawatir, and it's a separate category because here this evidence is as though the evidence comes from the Quran, right? It's so authentic because it's so massively transmitted that it's like the Quran's transmission. And the most common example of a mutawatir hadith would be من كذب علي متعمدا فليتبوأ مقعده من النار. That the Prophet ﷺ said, whosoever lies upon me intentionally, let them take their place in the hellfire. If a hadith is mutawatir, then it falls outside of the scope of hadith criticism because it's something that is so massively transmitted that it would be impossible for all of those links to have conformed upon a lie. So that's mutawatir. As far as hadith is concerned, there's a very minimal number of ahadith that has been unanimously regarded as mutawatir, and the scholars differ about this tremendously. So some have around less than 100 ahadith that are mutawatir. Others say even less than that, and others say more than that. But it's a very minimal category of ahadith. The overwhelming majority of ahadith falls within the scope of the ahadith. So you have either 3 or more links, right, in a particular stage of transmission at minimum, or you have at least 2 links, right, at minimum, or you have where the chain goes down to even 1 link. Now, this is not a declaration of how reliable the chain is or not. We've already given that process, right? We assess the transmitters and we assess contiguity. This is only a classification of how many links do we have at best within every chain of transmission. So you can see now that this format of describing various phenomena within the chain, whether we are describing the reliability of the chain, whether we are describing the contiguity of the chain, whether we are describing the number of links within a particular chain, these terms and technical terminology, also known as jargon, nomenclature, that describe these phenomena. And for the student, our job is, number one, to understand these phenomena, to understand them thoroughly, and then number two, to memorize them, because just getting the concept and then moving on to the next concept will essentially end up in a whole lot of terminology that you've memorized and you'll be confused about. Your approach from this point onwards should be, number one, understand it, and number two, memorize it. Number three would be to see it in practice as much as possible and to make it a living science for yourself. So we will do that collectively bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, but from this point onwards, we are going to enter into the scope of hadith terminology. Now, I like to use diagrams as opposed to simply using the text because it allows us to see where everything fits in. So that's why we have this mind map. We'll use this again at the beginning of the next lesson bi'idhnillah, and then we'll define the various concepts within this diagram, and that will take us through how we will approach the Nukhba going forward bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So this is just a bit of a preview of that, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. So what have we learned? We dealt with the 3 steps of hadith criticism, right? Looking at it through a contemporary lens. We dealt with rating transmitters and the contiguity of chains. And we dealt with hadith classification based on the number of chains. This has led us into the beginning of Nukhbatul Fikr fi Mustalahi Ahli al-Athar, and bi'idhnillah it will give us a chance to flow through the rest of the book, insha'Allah ta'ala. But it is up to you now to do due diligence in every lesson by understanding the concept, making sure you ask whatever questions that you need guidance with. That's why we have our answers forum. So if you're not registered for the course, do register, because you may need to be interacting with me in order to clarify certain concepts. So you can register. The details are on the screen now. And then you have the course notes. You have a quiz to test your knowledge of a lesson after you've completed it. And then you'll also have access to the answers forum, wherein you can ask a particular question and we'll specify an answer for your need in that particular question bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. But there's no escaping the work that is required here. Understand the concept, memorize the concept, see the concept in practice, move on to the next concept, and keep building. What you'll have at the end is a solid understanding of hadith terminology as well as its practical application within the sciences of hadith, which will give you, bi'idhnillah, a good solid foundation with which you can interact with the science and move forward and continue to learn bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. Until next time, jazakumullahu khairan wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad subhanallahi wa bihamdi subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Wassalamu alaykum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.